Hello and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and joining me here in the Murrieta studios is Dr. David Burns. Hi, David.
Hi, Fabrice.
Dr. David Burns has been a pioneer in the development of cognitive therapy, and he is the creator of the new team therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 20 languages. He is an emeritus adjunct clinical professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Okay, so this is the second part of our podcast on methods. And so last time we went over the cognitive distortions, and you gave some examples of all or nothing thinking, and you were going to share a vignette about magnification and minimization. So I'd love to hear about that.
I mentioned in the last podcast that I couldn't think of a good vignette, but I actually had one jotted down here on a piece of paper, but I forgot to look at it. But when I was in Cincinnati once, I was on a morning talk show that they were, talking about my book Feeling Good, and it was kind of fun. And then and they had one of these real handsome guys, was the TV guy, and
the anchorman.
Kind of a local popular show there in Cincinnati, an hour show with a live audience, and then so it went real well. And then afterwards, he said, "Oh, Dr. Burns, could I talk to you for a minute?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And then he says, I struggle myself with depression and anxiety. And I said, give me an example of that. What kind of thoughts do you have that upset you? And he said, well, every day I get about 300 fan letters about the show. I'll get about probably 300 on the show we just completed. And there'll be 299 will be glowing and positive and warm and loving and exciting letters, and then there'll be one real critical, angry letter. And he said, I find myself dwelling the entire day on that one negative letter and telling myself that all the 299 don't count. And that would be a great example of magnification and minimization, as well as mental filter and discounting the positive.
Yeah. I don't know if you know psychologist Rick Hansen.
No.
He has an expression for this type of mental behavior. He says that our brain is like Velcro for the bad and Teflon for the good.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it too. Absolutely. Well, today we're going to talk about you can change the way you feel when you change the way you think. And I actually gave a brief personal example of it last time in the last show. And I talked about, when I was upset and feeling depressed and anxious after being criticized by my mentor, Dr. Beck, for the way I handled a patient.
Yeah.
And it was crucial to write the negative thoughts down. And as the methods evolve on depression, we'll talk more about what the listeners can do if they're interested in using this technique for their own negative thoughts. But one thing, you've got to get them down on a piece of paper and identify the distortions.
Yeah, so write them down first. Yeah.
And then once you've identified the distortions in them, which is typically pretty easy, then you want to come up with a positive thought that has two characteristics. It has to be absolutely true. Has to be 100% true, because half-truths won't help a person.
You're not going to convince yourself,
Exactly. But in addition, it has to crush the belief in the negative thought. The belief in the negative thought has to go from 100 to 0 or 100 to 10. There has to be a dramatic change in the belief in the negative thought. And at that very instant, the feelings will change. And
because you won't believe them, essentially.
Yeah, once you no longer believe those negative thoughts, the thought, it'll have no impact on you. And discovering that your negative thought was not true, and that you're not a loser, that you're not hopeless, is one of the greatest experiences a human being can have. The joy that people have when you overcome depression it's a fantastic feeling. A lot of my patients have said it's like being born again. Many have said it's the greatest feeling in their entire life. Well, I'm going to give you a case that again emphasizes how what we used to call cognitive therapy, or the cognitive model, how that works. And for listeners who aren't familiar with it, cognition is just a fancy name for a thought. And again, the idea is negative thoughts cause depression. And when you change the way you think, you can change the way you feel.
And if I could ask you, what's a negative thought versus a non-negative thought?
Yeah, well, typical negative thoughts of the depressed person have to do with the thoughts that make you feel worthless and hopeless and loss of motivation and loss of pleasure and satisfaction in life. So there would be things like, I'm no good, I shouldn't have screwed up, I should be better than I am, I'm inferior to other people, I'm never going to get better, my problems are hopeless, that type of
doomsaying and self-deprecating.
Yeah, self-blaming thoughts, negative predictions about the future. Beck called it the cognitive triad. The depressed person has a negative view of the self, the world, and the future.
I see, yeah.
And when I give vignettes, I always disguise the name and location and details to protect the patient's confidentiality. But I'm going to talk about a patient I saw at our hospital in Philadelphia. I created a daily cognitive therapy group program, and once I created it, I would go in and sit in as part of my volunteer work for the university and teach and run the groups and show the local staff, some of the cognitive techniques.
Yeah.
And at the beginning of each group, I would hand out what I call the brief mood survey to see how depressed, suicidal, anxious, and angry every patient in the group is. It takes them 30 seconds to fill it out. They hand it to me, and I could just look at the scores and see exactly how each person is feeling and develop pretty much instant empathy.
Yeah.
And there was this one woman who I'll call Jennifer, and on the depression test, she scored 20 out of 20, which is the most severe depression a human being can have. And on the suicidal thoughts and urges scale, she scored 8 out of 8, indicating she had the most intense determination to commit suicide. She was also extremely, extremely anxious. And so once I saw that, I was a little alarmed and
of course. You don't want her to go and kill herself.
Yeah, and I said, can you tell us about yourself? And it looks like you're pretty suicidal and pretty depressed. And she said, well, this is my 8th hospitalization here, and I've been treated for 15 years for what's called rapidly cycling bipolar manic depressive illness.
Okay.
And most of the listeners know what that is, but if any don't, that's where you get extremely high and extremely low. You go into these mood cycles.
Yeah.
And if you have, I think, more than 2 a year or 3 a year, it's called rapidly cycling.
Yeah.
And that's considered the form of bipolar disorder with the worst prognosis. And
it's not very good. Yeah.
Yeah, she'd been treated for 15 years, and she said with mood stabilizers and antidepressants, and she'd had a couple of manic episodes, but tons of depressed episodes. And she said, nothing's been able to help me. And so I've just decided to do everyone a favor, and I'm going to commit suicide, today or as soon as I get the opportunity.
Yeah.
And I wanted to find out if she might be workable. Was she just defiantly saying, I'm going to commit suicide and you can't stop me, the way some people are, or was she saying, I would want help if there were help available. And so I said, Jennifer, I don't know if you've ever heard of cognitive therapy. These were in the days when cognitive therapy was still pretty new.
Oh, so the group you were working with, you were not doing cognitive therapy with them yet?
Yes, but she was just admitted to the hospital.
Okay, she was, yeah.
So she said, no, I've never... I don't know anything about cognitive therapy.
Yeah.
I've had conventional psychotherapy and pills, and no one's been able to help me. I said, well, if I could help you today, would you be open to that. I can't guarantee I can help you, but would you be willing to receive my help?
So you were doing agenda setting when you asked that question. Yeah.
Exactly. And fortunately, she was a very kind and compassionate individual. She says, yes, it would be great if you could help me. I've just kind of given up on things. And so I said, well, tell us just a little about yourself, and what are the negative thoughts that you're having that make you want to commit suicide? And we'll write them down. It's crucial to write them down. And she said, well, she was married and she had a loving husband and 2 sweet children who loved her a lot. And she said that her husband had a good job, and she had kind of a web design business that she was doing pretty well at, but she said the depressive episodes would, get in the way, so she'd have to not work for 6 or 8 weeks at a time when she was real depressed. It was kind of holding her back in her business. So that's the background. And her 3 thoughts that she wrote down on what we call the daily mood log. There's a column where you record your negative thoughts. There's a little table where you indicate your negative emotions and how strong they are. And her negative thoughts were, I'm a burden to my family, my doctors, and everyone who knows me. The second negative thought is they'd all be better off without me. Yeah. And the third negative thought is this effing disease has ruined my life. Yeah. And she believed each of those 100%. Right. And that, again, shows the impact of our thoughts on our feelings. And I think if anyone was thinking those thoughts, you too would be feeling pretty horribly depressed and maybe suicidal as well. For sure. And I said, which thought would you like to work on first? And she said, my family would be better off without me. My children, my husband, my parents, and the doctors would be better off if I were dead. Yeah. And so first you want to identify the distortions in these thoughts. What's the distortion in this one, Fabrice? Well, and we may want to give our listeners a chance to do that too. To begin with, this seems to be like it's pretty much of a black and white thinking. So that would be your all or nothing distortion. Mm-hmm. That's a good call. They'd be better off, and I need to kill myself for them to be better off. It's very drastic. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Would you consider it to be mind reading? Oh, completely, because of course she probably didn't ask them. She's assuming that they can't wait for her to keel off and exactly. And when you see someone else's distorted thoughts, they look ridiculous. Yeah. But when you're thinking it, you don't realize that you're distorting things. Yeah, internally it's very confusing. It could also be emotional reasoning. I feel like a burden. I feel like they'd be better off without me, so they would. I feel that I have no value to myself or to other people. Well, there seems to be a lot of self-blame. That's for sure. Oh yeah, that's huge. And then labeling. I'm a burden. Burden, yes. And a kind of a hidden should statement. I should not have depression. Yeah, I should not impose on all these people. Yeah. I should be better. I should, lots of shoulds. Right. Probably also external shoulds, like, this should not happen to me. And if she was angry, there would be an external should. In this case, it was mainly internal self-blame. So it was pretty easy for her to identify those distortions just by looking at the little table with the 10 distortions. And I want to point out that what you just said, identifying the distortions, is the name of one of the methods. Yeah, and it's so basic, it's right on the daily mood log itself. It's built right into the form where you record your thoughts. Now, the thing is, how are we going to help her challenge this thought? And my family would be better off. My family, my parents, my doctors, my children would be better off if I were dead. Yeah. And so we did something we'll talk about more detail in the future podcast, but we put that thought in what we call a recovery circle. And in the inpatient unit, the art department made us huge ones because all the patients would be sitting at a circular table.
Yeah.
And we'd put it in the middle of a table, and then I'd distribute my list of 50 techniques, which is written in consumer language.
Yeah.
And the patients selected 10 or 15 techniques we could use to help Jennifer challenge that thought, like, examine the evidence and the downward arrow technique and the experimental, all these different, to identify the distortions, and the double standard technique, and we'll bring those to life.
You can throw the book at it, yeah.
Yeah, and so
I wonder if we could put the recovery circle in the show notes for people to see what you mean.
Yeah, and maybe an example of Jennifer's daily mood log.
Sounds good, yes.
So we started going. I said to Jennifer, now I'm not sure. Here we got 15 techniques we can use to try to smash this thought. And I don't know which one will work. Is it okay if we try a number that don't work until we find the one that does work? Because I don't know which one is going to work.
Yes, exactly.
And she said that was fine. It's important to set it up like that, so you and the patient don't get panicky if one or three or five techniques.
Yeah, otherwise I might reinforce her also. Oh, I knew I was beyond any hope, or you can't help me.
Exactly. So we went through in the group about 7 techniques with her really quickly that weren't at all helpful, and she was still believing that her family would be better off if she were dead. And then we came to a technique one of the patients had suggested called examine the evidence.
Yeah, and so what is that?
Well, that's where you ask the patient. See, there's 2 things. There's examine the evidence and the experimental technique. Those are 2 so-called truth-based techniques. And the idea is that this was Beck's idea, that depressed people are like scientists who have a wrong theory about the universe. And so a scientist can do an experiment to test the theory, or the scientist can examine evidence that's already available, say published data, or go and do library research to see if his or her thinking is valid.
Right.
So experimental technique and examine the evidence came up, and so I said, well, Diane, I'm not quite sure how I'd use this, and this might sound grotesque to ask you this question, but how did you come to the conclusion that your husband and your doctors and your children and your parents want you to die? Like, do your children come to you and say, "Oh, Mommy, we want you to commit suicide because you're a burden to us"? Has your husband suggested maybe suicide would be a good option? Have your doctors recommended this?
Prescription.
Yeah, and she said, "Oh no, they would never say that, but I'm sure they're thinking it."
Right.
And I said, "Well, here maybe you're jumping to conclusions again with more mind reading. You're just assuming that they're thinking that, and you feel so terrible. That's emotional reasoning. You feel they must want you dead, but we don't have any evidence for that. Now, if they were here, I think your husband's coming for a session, a family therapy session after the group. You could ask him, and I could tell the family therapist what came up in group. All you could do here is you could ask the group members what they think.
Do a survey.
Yeah, do a survey. A survey, that's a kind of experiment.
Yeah.
And she said, "Oh, they wouldn't be honest with me. They just tell me what they think I want to hear." They said, "See, you're jumping to conclusions again. You're doing more mind reading. We don't know if they'd be honest or not, but first you could ask the group members, do you think my family would be better off if I commit suicide? And then second, you could ask them, are you telling the truth or just blowing smoke in my face?" You and I will cross-examine them if you want.
Yeah.
And she said, "Oh, I guess it would be worth a shot." So she turned to there was a young woman sitting next to me. Jennifer was in the opposite side of the circle from me. And I said, "Well, you could start with her." And I turned to this woman next to me, a young woman, she's about 21, and she had tears streaming down her face. And so Jennifer said, "Well, do you think my family would be better off if I kill myself?" and the woman sitting next to me said, Jennifer, you're crazy. You don't know what the hell you're talking about. She said, my baby brother committed suicide 6 years ago. His bedroom was right next to mine. And one night I heard a gunshot. I thought, oh no. And I ran into his bedroom, and he had taken the family's deer rifle and blown his brains out. And then she started sobbing, and she said, was my brother depressed? You bet he was. Was he a pain in the ass? You bet he was. Was he a burden? You bet he was. Did we want him to die? Nothing could be further from the truth. I have grieved for him every minute of every day. I can't get it out of my mind. I feel ashamed. I feel guilty. It was a tragedy, and I would give my life today if that would give him another shot at life.
Yeah.
And she said, your husband loves you, and you don't even know it. Your children love you, and you don't even know it. And tears were just going down her face. And so I said to Jennifer, do you believe her, or do you think she's just telling you what you want to hear? And Jennifer says, wow, she seems to be telling the truth. And I said, why don't you ask the next person? The next one was a nurse from the hospital. And she said, do you think my family would be better off without me? Do you think I should commit suicide? And then I looked at her, and tears were going down her cheeks, and she said, my baby brother also committed suicide.
Oh, you're kidding.
But it was 20 years ago. And I have grieved every day, and I will grieve his loss until the day I die. You know, your family loves you. You don't even know it. And she went around the table, and a lot of people had made suicide attempts or had close friends or family members who had made suicide attempts, and she got this message from every person. And then I said, now, how strongly do you believe this thought, which she had been believing 100%, my family would be better off without me? And she said, Dr. Burns, my belief in that thought is zero. She says, I 10 minutes ago, I would have sworn that was true, and now it seems ridiculous. And I don't know how I got that idea that my children, my husband would want me to commit suicide. It makes no sense at all. And I said, are you feeling any different now? She's saying, I'm actually feeling a lot less depressed, but I still have these two other thoughts.
Right.
Can you help me with those? It still seems true that this effing disease has ruined my life, and that I'm a burden to other people. And those thoughts, I don't see how I can challenge them, because they just seem like the gospel
they're
truth.
Still there, yeah.
And I said, well, I'll show you another technique. I don't know if it'll help you, but it's called externalization of voices. Or, we'll both become Jennifer. And you be the negative Jennifer, and I'll be the positive Jennifer. And you talk to me the way you talk to yourself, and I'll see if I can find a way to smash those thoughts. So she said, okay, I'm going to be the negative Jennifer, doctor, and you'll be the positive Jennifer, and I, the negative Jennifer, are saying to you, this effing disease has ruined your life, and you're a burden to your family, your parents, your children, your husband, and your doctors, and that's a fact, Jennifer, and you can't deny it. So what do you have to say, positive Jennifer? So
she had you play the positive Jennifer.
Yeah, I told her I would play the positive Jennifer first, then we'd do a role reversal if she liked the technique. And I said, well, partially I'm going to plead guilty as accused, and partly I'm going to defend myself. When you say that this effing disease has ruined my life, there's a lot of distortions there, like all or nothing thinking. It's not true that this effing disease has ruined my life. It's held me back. That's for sure. But I've been a good mom, I've been a good wife, and I've done well with my business, in spite of having this rapidly cycling bipolar disorder, whatever it is. And
So you're disputing, that negative thought.
Yeah. It hasn't ruined my life. Life would be a lot better if I didn't have this, but I can be darn proud of what I've accomplished. And as far as you're saying that I'm a burden, that one I'll plead guilty as accused. And I'll tell you this, I didn't ask God to give me rapidly cycling bipolar illness. And that was God's decision. And so if God wants me to have this disease and be a burden, well, then I'll just accept it and I'll just be the best little burden I can be. And when I said that, she just burst into laughter and she said, "You mean it's okay to be a burden?" I said, "Absolutely. We all take turns at being burdens. That's what love is about. That's what a family is about. So we all get sick at times. Sometimes we give and sometimes receive. Your problem has never been that you're a burden. Your problem, it's a should statement. You've been telling yourself you shouldn't be a
That's
burden."
Right, yeah.
And she just got it. And she said, I am feeling so much better right now. And then I said, "Would you mind just taking the depression test again?" That's again why I like having these little shorts of 5-item tests. You can take it and score it and interpret your score. You could do all of that in 15 seconds. And remember, her score had been 20 out of 20.
That's right. She was at the top of the scale. Yeah.
And she took it, and her score had dropped to 0. And this whole intervention took maybe 20 or 25 minutes, and she was completely symptom-free. And I found it very interesting that even though she was a card-carrying 4-star manic depressive illness, it's a real genetic abnormality. We don't know the cause of it, but it's some biological cause, that she made more progress in 25 minutes of what in those days we called cognitive therapy than she had in 15 years of conventional treatment and psychopharmacology.
Yeah, it's quite striking. And did you hear from her after that? Was that a lasting effect?
Well, I was not her doctor.
I see, yeah.
I went in once a week to do my volunteer work there at the hospital. In my clinical practice, I worked with people. I've had about 35,000 therapy sessions with bipolar patients with routine depression who don't have the up and down type, and patients with anxiety disorders. And the long term has not ever been a problem for me. You've got to do relapse prevention training because these negative thoughts will have a tendency to come back.
Sure.
But if a person knows how to deal with them, then they can pop out of a bad mood quickly. I define a relapse as 1 minute or more of feeling pretty crappy. And given that definition, we all probably relapse 2 or 3 times every day.
I know.
But it's okay if you don't get stuck in it. I think the other thing I would say is I used to run, I think I mentioned this on a previous pod, I don't remember, but I used to run the lithium clinic at the VA hospital at the medical school in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And those patients did terribly. That was before I learned the psychotherapy techniques, and all I had was psychopharmacology, and they were going in and out of the hospital. I've managed personally dozens of patients with severe bipolar illness, like Jennifer, and some of them need to stay on a medication. They'll need some long-term maintenance of the bipolar illness. I used to use lithium at low doses. But they did really well. The prognosis, I used to think for bipolar illness was poor. Once I learned the psychotherapy and I had more than just drugs to throw at the problem, I saw that the prognosis was extremely good. People had highly productive, joyous lives, but you have to keep your eye on the, especially the highs as well as the lows.
It's not like, it's done once and you don't have to watch yourself again. Now, to summarize, what you described with Jennifer was what you call the externalization of voices.
And the acceptance paradox, as well as the self-defense paradigm.
Yeah, and so combining all this, you actually do a role play where one person plays the negative voice, the other person plays the positive voice, and there's this back and forth.
Yeah, and you do role reversals too. If the patient can't see it, you keep doing role reversals until the patient kind of gets their enlightenment.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I love externalization of voices is particularly now that we have even more powerful tools than I had when I was working with Jennifer, because now we have all these techniques to melt away resistance.
Yeah.
And when you do externalization of voices, in my experience, you generally see very rapid total elimination of symptoms, just as with her, just in a matter of minutes. It's pretty spectacular.
Well, that was a very striking example. Thank you for talking about this. I think that gives a little bit of a taste of what the methods are like. We've really looked at the more cognitive methods, and we've also mainly looked at the mood problems, specifically depression. So I think in future podcasts we'll probably kind of broaden the approach and see more methods and more different type of conditions that can be addressed.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I've never gotten tired of this. I'm kind of addicted to doing therapy because when you see a patient change before your very eyes in a profound and total way, you see them go, in this case, hopeless depression and suicidal urges to overwhelming joy. It's just the most mind-boggling experience. And it's in this field, if you went into psychotherapy for riches, then you're kind of psychotic, because it's a tough field. There's tons of therapists, and with managed care, it's hard to make a decent living at it. But the riches we get, that maybe a Bill Gates wouldn't have these riches, is to see people's innermost lives and to have the privilege of being with them at the moment of change, and it's a fantastic thing.
I completely agree with you. When I see a patient who's leaving my office with that look of gratitude in their eyes, it's just I'm repaid 1,000-fold for any other things I may have suffered. So, all right. Well, thank you very much. So we'll continue with the next podcast. Okay.
Thank you, Fabrice.
This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this podcast under the blog page, and where you can leave your comments and questions. The website has an abundance of resources for therapists as well as non-therapists, including books, workshops, a list of online training groups around the world, and much more. Theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donsel. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.